Hello and welcome to the OTB channel. Have you ever wondered, in this modern age where computers have, well, potentially dozens of gigabytes of RAM, why on earth you still need to allocate swap space? Let's discuss after the intro. Right, welcome back and cheers. Nice cup of coffee here. So let me start today's video by just apologising. This is only the second video this week. Real life has started to kick in as the lockdown comes to an end and I've just been short of time. So that said, let's talk about the subject of the video. To swap or not, using swap in modern computers. I've chosen this subject because I've lost count over the years of just how many times I've been asked by users I've been supporting, do I need to create a swap partition or a swap file, and just exactly how much swap should I be creating? And I'm not surprised that I keep being asked those questions because often there isn't a clear answer. Opinions vary depending on where you look, and it becomes even more complex now that we've got computers that are running 32 gig or more of RAM because they have loads of physical memory installed, and the chances are, all things being well, their computers will never actually have to access the swap space. Well, before we start, let me tell you what I use. Irrespective of how much RAM I've got in my computer. I've got 16 gig at the moment. I use a swap file as opposed to a swap partition of 4 gig. And I take steps to ensure that that is accessed as infrequently as possible. Why do I make the decision to set up that configuration? Well, hopefully that will be clear as we go through this video. So let's get started. Okay. Well, before we start, let me just get rid of a myth. If you've got a computer with 8 gigs of physical RAM installed, and you also have an 8 gig swap partition or swap file, that does not mean you have the equivalent of 16 gig of RAM in terms of if you had 16 gigs of physical RAM installed on your computer. Swap space is much slower to use than physical RAM. So if your computer is using swap all the time, its performance is likely to be quite poor as compared to if it was just using physical RAM. And if you find yourself in a situation where swap is being used an awful lot, there's a simple answer here. You need more memory. Go out and buy some more RAM if that's at all possible. So that said, you might think that swap then needs to be, or the use of swap needs to be avoided at all costs. Well, yes and no. You would prefer that your system always just uses physical memory, but there are occasions when swap can be useful. So looking at the first bullet point here, you might be using a really memory intensive application, for instance, video editing software. You saw my experience with Kdenlive a few weeks ago. When that situation happens and you have an application that is really RAM hungry, swap can help because your system can swap out pages of memory to a swap file to free up more physical RAM for the system to deal with its immediate demands. So if you suddenly find that your memory's all being used up, perhaps you've got a system with a not huge amount of memory, swap can be quite useful on the occasions where you're using it to its full capability. It's also the case that many applications, when they launch all sorts of processes that allocate themselves blocks of RAM, but once you've started up the application, they are essentially inactive, but they are taking up portions of your RAM that cannot be used. Your system has the capability to swap them out to your swap partition or swap file and free up resources for dealing with active processes, which makes sense. The third reason why swap might be used is if you hibernate your system. Hibernation, or otherwise known as suspend to disk, requires that the system state in memory is swapped out to disk space, be that a swap partition or a swap file. So you use that as part of the suspend to disk process. This has perhaps become less common with the onset of SSDs, where we attempt to minimize the disk writes to SSDs at all times, and on many Linux systems it isn't actually activated by default and you would have to take physical steps to get it working. Nevertheless, hibernation is still one of the reasons why swap is used. So, just to summarize, why would you use swap? Well, your system has a small amount of RAM and you're tending to use it to its full capability. You use RAM-intensive programs. You hibernate your system, or worst case scenario, you could also get an application that goes rogue and suddenly starts eating up all of your RAM. And if you have a swap space where your RAM can swap out pages of memory to, it gives you a little bit more time to try and sort it out before your system crashes. So you might be saying after that, well, hold on, Steve. I've got 32 gig of RAM in my system. Nothing I use ever gets anywhere close to using up my physical RAM, even when I'm doing such things as video editing. And if I don't need a swap space, I would rather save that disk space for more important things than creating a swap partition or a swap file. And that may be a viable answer. The choice is completely yours. There is always, of course, the odd chance that you could get a rogue application that starts eating up all of your memory, but you take the chance. You may decide, however, that, overall it sounds like it's going to be safer to create some sort of swap space just in case. The question you're then going to be faced with is, well, how much do I need to create? Well, this is where opinions vary wildly. When I first started using Linux 16 years ago, we were still using machines with 128 meg, 256 meg of RAM at most. And the advice then was your swap space should be at least 2 times your physical RAM, but ideally 2.5 times your physical RAM, or even more. And 2.5 times was what I used to see most of the time. That's come down a little bit as RAM sizes have gone up and up. And now we see, well, a range of different suggestions. Some web pages will suggest that you use swap space equal to twice your physical RAM. Others suggest that your swap space should be equal to your physical RAM. So if you have 8 gig of physical RAM installed, you should have an 8 gig swap space. Others say that actually even that rule is perhaps a little bit over the top. If you have 16 gig of RAM, you should limit yourself to 8 gig as an absolute maximum as far as swap space is concerned, because the chances are you're not going to need more than that, and then pick any other alternative in between, because depending upon where you look, the answer will probably be different. So given the disagreements, What are you going to choose? Because there is no definitive answer. Well, I take the view that if you do hibernate your system, that your swap space should be equivalent to the amount of physical RAM that you have installed. So if you have 8 gig of RAM, create an 8 gig swap space if you hibernate. If you don't hibernate, well, I would suggest that you don't need anywhere near that, and 4 or 5 gigs will probably be sufficient on a just-in-case basis, which is the reason that I create a 4 gig partition, because it's just there for just in case. I don't hibernate my system, so to me, it's a little bit of extra safety. Do I need it? No, probably not. I very rarely see my computer actually use swap space, which is a good thing. But nevertheless, you have to make that decision. Now, there are some resources out there that make some suggestions, but it's important that you just see these as suggestions. One of them is the Ubuntu, what was the wiki, the Ubuntu documents page. And looking at what they say, I'm just going to move to the combined view now. They have listed a range of different possible sizes based on, 1, how much RAM you have installed, and 2, whether or not you use hibernation. And we start at 1 gig and move all the way up to 64 gig. And you can see they start at 1 gig of RAM, which, let's face it, these days, that's not many people. And they say you should have a minimum of 512 meg of swap if you don't hibernate. And as you move up through the scale, up to 4 gigs, they're saying you should have 50% of your physical RAM as swap space. And then that starts to get less and less and less the more physical RAM you have installed. So even if you have 64 gigs on your system, they're saying an 8 gig swap space would be sufficient. And if, like me, you have 16 gigs, they're saying a 4 gig swap space will be sufficient. I think that's quite sensible. Let's face it, if you have 64 gig of RAM and you follow the advice to create a swap partition of twice the size of your physical RAM, do you really want to be wasting 128 gigabytes of space on a RAM partition? I certainly wouldn't, especially if I'm using SSDs. When we move over to the third column, though, they're not as conservative as I would be. So for 1 and 2 gigs of RAM, they're saying, well, your swap should be equivalent to your RAM size, but then they start to increase that from 4 gig onwards. So they're saying if you've got 4 gig of RAM and you hibernate, you should use 6 or create a 6 gig swap space. And it goes all the way up so that if you've got 16 gig installed and you hibernate, they're saying 20 gig of swap space. And if you've got 64 gig installed, they're saying you should use 72 gig of swap space. I think you could probably come down to a swap space equivalent to your physical RAM if you hibernate. But given the amount of space that you would be using if you hibernate your system, the amount of wasted disk space, in my opinion, that results from hibernating your system would put me off hibernating anyway, even if I did it, which I don't. So the big issue here is, do you hibernate or do you not hibernate? If you do hibernate, you're going to need to allocate a big chunk of your physical disk space to swap. If you don't, well, it's up to you. Yes, you could get away without it, but as long as you have the available disk space, a 4, 5, 6 gig swap partition or swap file should be enough. Now, that brings us to the issue of, do you create a swap partition or do you create a swap file? Again, opinions vary. Some distros don't even bother these days on the automatic installation to create a swap file. They just automatically create, to create a swap partition, they just automatically create a swap file. And in terms of performance, there isn't a huge amount of difference. You can see some people saying, well, there's minor performance differences here and there, but overall, it doesn't really matter. I suppose one of the considerations for me is if I'm multi-booting 3 or 4 different Linux systems on a hard drive or an SSD, if I create a swap partition, I can reuse that swap partition for each of the Linux systems, so I don't have to keep recreating it. But if I've got just a single system, I'll probably just go the way of creating a swap file. And the way you do this is pretty simple. We've got a couple of commands, and you can see the first one there. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this. Forlocate, fallocate. Fallocate sounds right. You would do these as root or with sudo. So if you wanted to create a 4 gig swap file, it would just be a case of fallocate -l 4g, and then I normally create my swap file at /. So I wouldn't create it in my home directory. I would create it as / swap file. You could also use dd. That was the traditional way of doing it. It's a little bit slower, but tends to be more reliable. And the format is pretty simple. You take the input of dev0 and you output it to a swap file. I've put it in the same place there, so / swap file. I've said the block size is 1024 kilobits, and the count therefore is 4194304. Where does that come from? Well, based on the fact that there are 1024 bytes to a kilobyte and 1024 kilobytes to a megabyte and 1024 megabytes to a gigabyte. Do the math. It works its way out. After that, just follow the instructions. You'll find them anywhere. The Arch wiki is particularly good. Do a chmod 600 on the swap file. Do a make swap, swap on, and stick it in your fstab to make sure that it comes on each time you boot. So like me, you've decided that on a just-in-case basis, you're going to create some swap space at least, but you want to minimize the amount of times that your system actually uses it so that it only uses it when absolutely necessary. Is it possible to control that sort of variable? Well, yes, it is. We have a concept called swappiness. Swappiness can actually have a value of between 0 to 100, and that value dictates how likely it will be that the kernel will use swap space. The higher the value, the more likely it would be that it would use it. So if you set the value at 100, the chances are your system would chug along using swap constantly. That's something that you're going to want to avoid. Most systems come with the value defaulting to 60. But if you want that to be less, and if you have an SSD, I would suggest you're going to want it to be less in order to minimize the writes. I like to set it to around 10. You can use a command systemctl vm.swappiness to view exactly what your system is set at. And as I say, most of them will be 60. But you can permanently change it by editing in Arch anyway, etc sysctl.d 99.swappiness.conf. You may have to create that file, and you just put in an entry there of vm.swappiness equals 10, or whatever you want. You might want to go all the way down to 1, completely up to yourself, and save that. Not quite sure whether the locations are different on Ubuntu. I'm using that same location on my Debian stable system, but just do a quick Google and it will tell you. So you can control how likely it is your kernel is going to use swap anyway. So that's pretty much it for today. Where did we end up as far as how you use swap on modern computers? Well, I would say if you use Hibernate, create a swap partition or a swap file equivalent to your physical RAM. If you don't hibernate, it's up to you. If you make the decision to create a small amount of space on a just-in-case basis, fine. If you decide to go without swap altogether, you're probably going to be okay. You really are, especially if you've got a lot of RAM. The choice is yours completely. In Linux, of course, there are always other options. And if minimizing writes to disk is one of your priorities, you may want to look at ZRAM and ZSwap, where your physical RAM is used to compress memory to minimize disk writes. It's beyond the scope of this video, but the Arch Wiki has a really good write-up. So that's it for today, guys. Don't forget to join me on LBRY, or come and join us on our Facebook group. It's getting quite active now, and the guys have been playing around installing Arch with my Arch script text file that I put up last week. And oh yeah, as an update, 2 weeks into using Spectre WM, all good so far. I've now got Xmonad configured, which I'll move to after I finish with Spectre. And if anyone of you wants to have a look at my config file, it's also on my GitLab page. That's it for today, guys. Have a great weekend.